the epic arrival of the Irish who transformed England's industrial cities. In the autumn of 1845, a silent killer arrived on Irish soil. It came without warning, without mercy, and without a name that anyone yet understood. Within days, entire fields of potatoes turned black, collapsed into a foul-smelling rot, and became completely inedible. For the vast majority of Ireland's 8.5 million people, this was not merely an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. The potato was not simply a preference, it was survival itself. Centuries of British land policy had systematically pushed Irish tenant farmers onto smaller and smaller plots of land, leaving them with no realistic alternative. Grain, dairy and livestock were grown across Ireland, but almost all of it was shipped directly to England by absentee landlords. The poor ate potatoes because there was nothing else. The fungus responsible, Phytophthora infestans, had travelled from the Toluca Valley in Mexico, spread across North America, and crossed the Atlantic on cargo ships. It thrived in Ireland's cool, wet climate, destroying entire fields within days. By 1846, the second consecutive failure made the scale of the catastrophe undeniable. Families who had survived one terrible winter now faced another with nothing in reserve. The question that haunted every household across Connaught, Munster and Ulster was the same: stay and die, or leave and risk everything? Landlords export grain while millions face starvation. While Irish men, women and children collapsed from hunger in roadside ditches, the ships leaving Irish ports were loaded to capacity. Almost 4,000 vessels carried Irish-grown grain, butter and livestock to the ports of Bristol, Glasgow, Liverpool and London during 1847 alone, the very year that historians would later call Black 47. In that single year, roughly 400,000 people in Ireland died of starvation and disease. The British government, under the laissez-faire doctrine of the Whig administration led by Lord John Russell, refused to halt exports. Charles Trevelyan, the civil servant placed in charge of famine relief, was a particularly harsh advocate of non-intervention, openly stating that the famine was a judgment of God on an indolent people. Public works schemes were introduced, forcing starving labourers to break stones and build roads for wages that could not cover even basic food costs. Soup kitchens were eventually opened in 1847, but were shut down after only a few months. Meanwhile, the British government spent approximately £8 million on total relief efforts, a figure historians have consistently described as catastrophically insufficient given the scale of the disaster. In the first 9 months of 1847 alone, over 800,000 gallons of butter were exported from Ireland to England. The contrast between what was leaving Ireland and what remained for its people became one of the most bitterly contested moral questions of the 19th century. Desperate families sell everything to afford passage. For those who had survived long enough to consider leaving, the process of emigration was itself a brutal ordeal. The average passage from an Irish port to Liverpool cost between 4 and 10 shillings, a sum that represented weeks of wages for a labourer, if he had any wages at all. Many families sold their last remaining possessions: a cooking pot, a blanket, a piece of land they no longer had the strength to farm. Some landlords, eager to clear their estates and convert tillage to more profitable grazing, paid the fares themselves, not out of compassion, but because it was cheaper to ship a family to Liverpool than to maintain them in a workhouse. Emigration soared from 75,000 in 1845 to 250,000 in 1851. The departure scenes at small ports along the west coast, Westport, Killala, Kinsale, were described by witnesses as amongst the most distressing sights of the century. Entire villages emptied. Those with enough resources aimed for America. Those without boarded the short crossing to England, hoping that the industrial cities promised something the dying Irish countryside no longer could. Liverpool became the first destination for hundreds of thousands. The lodging houses near the docks were immediately notorious, overcrowded, filthy and controlled by racketeers who exploited the desperation of newly arrived families who did not yet know the city or speak its rhythms. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming content about the United Kingdom and its history. Thank you for your support, and now let's continue. Overcrowded ships crossed the Irish Sea in squalor. The crossing from Ireland to Britain was short in distance but devastating in reality. Deck passengers had lower legal priority than livestock and cargo. On many vessels, up to 2,000 people were crowded onto an open deck in all weather conditions, clinging to one another to avoid being swept overboard. There was no shelter, no sanitation, and often no food. The ships that carried Irish emigrants across the Irish Sea were not the famous coffin ships of the transatlantic route. Those were larger vessels bound for North America and Canada. But the conditions on the shorter crossing were, in many cases, no less lethal. Emigrants arrived at the Liverpool docks cold, malnourished, frequently infected with typhus or dysentery, and almost entirely without resources. The mortality rate among those passing through Liverpool in 1847 exceeded 15%. The lodging houses at the docks were described in parliamentary records as little more than human warehouses. Hundreds of immigrants crammed into rooms with men, women and children lying on cold floors without blankets. Emigrants were routinely robbed, sold worthless goods, and charged extortionate rates for basic shelter. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. The port authorities of Liverpool were overwhelmed. In 1847 alone, approximately 300,000 Irish passed through the city, a number that strained every resource the city possessed and permanently altered its demographic character. Liverpool receives thousands of starving Irish daily. By 1851, Liverpool had become something it had never been designed to be, a city of refuge for the dispossessed. At least 1/4 of the city's entire population was Irish-born by that year, earning Liverpool the widely used description of Ireland's second capital. The sheer volume of arrivals was staggering. In the worst weeks of Black 47, ships were docking daily with passengers too weak to disembark unaided. The Liverpool workhouse, built to accommodate 3,000 people, held over 7,000 at its peak. The streets around the docks, Vauxhall, Scotland Road, Toxteth, became dense concentrations of Irish settlement almost overnight. Cellar dwellings, originally built for storage, were rented out as living quarters. Multiple families shared single rooms with no ventilation, no clean water, and no means of removing waste. Typhus, known at the time as Irish fever, spread from the docks into the wider city and killed thousands of Liverpool residents who had never left England. The city's medical officer, Dr. William Henry Duncan, the first medical officer of health appointed in Britain, reported conditions that he described as incompatible with human survival. In 1845, Liverpool's population was approximately 250,000. By 1851, it had reached 376,000. The Irish had not merely arrived in Liverpool, they had fundamentally and permanently transformed it. Navvies build Britain's railways with bare hands. While the dying were still arriving at Liverpool's docks, those with enough strength were already being absorbed into the most physically demanding labour the industrial world had ever organised. Britain's railway expansion was at its peak precisely when Irish emigration reached its height, and the two forces collided with historic consequences. During the 1840s, at the height of what contemporaries called railway mania, approximately 250,000 workers were employed across Britain laying tracks, blasting tunnels, and building embankments entirely by hand. Irish workers, known as navvies, a term derived from the earlier canal navigators, constituted roughly 30% of that total workforce. On certain lines, such as the Chester to Holyhead route, Irish workers made up nearly 50% of all labourers. The work was extraordinary in its physical demands and catastrophic in its human cost. In 1849, there was no compensation for death or injury. The death rate among the workers who constructed the Woodhead Tunnel between 1839 and 1852 exceeded the casualty rate among British soldiers at the Battle of Waterloo. Men worked 12-hour shifts using picks, shovels, and occasional explosives. They lived in temporary encampments beside the work sites, in timber and turf huts with no sanitation. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus circulated constantly through these camps. The navvies moved from project to project across the country, building the infrastructure of modern Britain with tools that had barely changed in a century. Irish families crowd into Manchester's notorious Little Island. Manchester in the 1840s was simultaneously the most advanced industrial city in the world and one of the most lethal places a human being could live. Its population had grown from 22,000 in 1773 to over 316,000 by 1851, and the infrastructure had never kept pace with that growth. The Irish settled heavily in a district near Oxford Road known as Little Ireland, a low-lying area enclosed by the railway line and the loop of the River Medlock, surrounded on all sides by 13 factories. The houses had originally been built as modest middle-class residences, but by the 1840s they had been subdivided and sublet until single rooms housed entire families, and cellars designed for coal storage were rented as permanent accommodation. The river sat above the level of the surrounding housing, meaning that flooding was constant and the ground was perpetually damp. By 1851, 15% of Manchester's total population was Irish-born. The Irish community in Manchester was the third largest in Britain, behind only London and Liverpool. Friedrich Engels, who lived in Manchester in the early 1840s with his Irish partner Mary Burns, described Little Ireland in his 1845 study The Condition of the Working Class in England as a horrid little slum of broken windows, rotten door frames, open gutters filled with filth, and an atmosphere permanently darkened by chimney smoke. The district covered approximately 4 acres and housed thousands of people in conditions of almost unimaginable density. Cholera and typhus killed thousands in the slums. The diseases that followed the Irish across the Irish Sea did not remain confined to the docks or the navvy camps. They spread through the cellar dwellings, the shared privies, and the contaminated water supplies of every major industrial city in England. In Manchester, a Royal Commission on the Health of Towns conducted in 1844 discovered that the average life expectancy of a labourer in the city was just 17 years. Infant mortality in the worst districts exceeded 400 deaths per 1,000 live births. Cholera had already struck Manchester in 1832, killing thousands. The first 2 victims recorded in Little Ireland were a 5-year-old boy named Thomas Kavanagh and his mother Elizabeth, a washerwoman aged 36 who had survived on potatoes and tea. Thomas displayed symptoms on the night of Sunday, the 27th of May, 1832, and died 2 days later. The links between unsanitary conditions and the spread of disease were understood by the 1840s, but the political will to act moved slowly. Cellar dwellings were sealed by authorities in the late 1840s. The 1845 Sanitary Improvement Act and the 1847 Manchester Corporation Waterworks Act followed directly from the public health crisis created by extreme overcrowding. Typhus, carried by lice and spreading rapidly in the conditions of the slums, became so strongly associated with the Irish population that it was referred to across England simply as Irish fever, a name that carried prejudice as much as medical fact. Anti-Irish riots erupt across industrial English cities. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of Irish workers into the industrial cities of England did not happen peacefully. The tensions that built up in the 1840s and 1850s erupted periodically into open violence that left lasting marks on the communities where it occurred. Anti-Irish sentiment combined 3 distinct sources of hostility: religious bigotry directed at Catholics, economic resentment from English workers who feared wage competition, and a broader cultural prejudice that portrayed the Irish as racially inferior. Parliamentary reports and newspaper accounts from the period document periodic outbreaks of mob violence in Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Leeds. Irish workers were accused of undercutting wages, a charge that had some basis in the economic desperation that drove many to accept whatever terms were offered. English working-class communities, themselves living in poverty, found in the Irish a visible and available target for frustrations rooted in the industrial system itself. The press amplified these tensions consistently. In Manchester, the Irish community became a focal point for debates about crime, public order, and national character. The city also became a centre of Irish republicanism. The Fenian movement found significant support among the Manchester Irish, and when 3 Irish men were executed in Manchester in 1867, accused of killing a police officer during a rescue attempt, they became known internationally as the Manchester Martyrs, transforming local violence into a cause that resonated across 2 continents. Irish workers quietly power Britain's industrial revolution. The full scale of what the Irish contributed to Britain's industrial transformation took decades to become visible, precisely because so much of it happened underground, in tunnels, in mill basements, and in the least celebrated corners of the Victorian economy. By 1861, more than 800,000 Irish-born people lived in mainland Britain, and that figure doubled when their British-born children were included. They had dug the canals, laid the railways, operated the looms, and built the sewers that made modern urban life possible. In Birmingham, large numbers of Irish workers had arrived as early as the 1820s, drawn by the city's rapid industrial expansion. In Leeds and Bradford, Irish labour was central to the textile industry. In London, the Irish formed the backbone of the dock workforce. The Irish-born population in England and Wales reached 602,000 by 1861, representing 3% of the total population. A red plaque now stands at 8 Great Marlborough Street in Manchester. honouring those who fled desperate circumstances and powered an industrial revolution that made Britain the wealthiest nation on earth. The cost they paid, in lives, in dignity, in the daily reality of discrimination, was never formally acknowledged by the institutions that benefited most from their labour. What they built, however, remains standing to this day.